My mom didn't yell. She never had to. She stirred her tea slowly, her eyes cold, and said, "You're not one of us anymore." That was it. No explanation, no warning. Just a quiet dismissal that left me frozen at the kitchen table. I tried to speak, tried to explain myself, but the words caught in my throat like stones. She glanced at my sister and smiled warmly, a smile I had never earned, never deserved. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were pressing me out. I realized, with a sinking clarity, that I had been erased, right there, in my own home. And as I left that house for the last time, I swore I would never let her see me broken again. My name is Emily Carter. I was 28 and living in a small, gray apartment above a quiet bakery in my hometown of Ashford, a place most people drove through without a second glance. I had always been patient. The kind of person my mom called, too soft for this family. I worked as a medical assistant in a local clinic, long hours that left my hands raw and my mind exhausted. But it gave me a sense of purpose my family had never offered. Mornings were the hardest. I would wake before the sun. The faint hum of traffic outside mixing with my own restless thoughts. My apartment was tiny but orderly, every corner scrubbed, every dish in its place. I brewed my coffee slowly, savoring the warmth as it spread through my fingers, my eyes scanning the small windowsill where I kept a single photo me, smiling at 16. Holding a ribbon from a school competition. My mom's face hovered in the background of that memory, distant, disapproving. Some days, I imagined knocking on her door, telling her I had a small win at work or simply sharing a thought, but I knew the answer before I reached her. She had a way of looking at me that made me feel invisible. A shadow in my own family. I remember one morning when I brought homemade cookies to the kitchen, hoping to share them. My sister, Anna, was there, laughing at something my mom said, glowing in that familiar warmth. My mom barely glanced at me before setting the plate aside and asking Anna about her new boyfriend. I smiled tightly, nodded, and left the room, feeling the cold press of neglect on my skin like ice. Even in casual conversation, my mom made it clear I didn't belong. At a family dinner last month, she had praised Anna's promotion in front of everyone while making a pointed comment about lack of direction. I felt my hands tighten around my fork, knuckles white, my chest aching with the weight of years of quiet erasure. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Every word, every glance, every pause screamed that I had been written out of the story of our family. I often returned to the mornings in my apartment to recover, pacing the small living space, listening to the distant chatter of people beginning their day below. I watched the world outside the window, and wonder if I ever truly mattered to anyone but myself. My sister's laughter echoed in my mind, sharp and unfair. And yet, even with the sting, there was a spark of resolve I could feel in my chest, like a pulse insisting I wasn't done, that my story wasn't over. These mornings were my refuge, and the brief calls I occasionally received from friends or colleagues were the threads I held onto. They reminded me existed outside my mother's indifference. Still, I could feel her presence even from a distance, a shadow that stretched across my quiet life, waiting, watching, and judging. It was in these small, ordinary moments that I realized how much my life had been shaped by her neglect. How much anger and determination had quietly grown inside me, like a river carving its path beneath the surface. And I knew, without fully admitting it even to myself yet, that something had to change before the quiet turned into complete surrender. I still remember the first time I realized my mom had started erasing me. I was 12. Sitting at the dinner table, waiting for her to ask about my school project. I had spent hours building a small model of our town, carefully painting every house and tree. My sister Anna got a new bike that day, and my mom's eyes lit up when she asked about it. "Isn't it beautiful?" she said, ruffling Anna's hair, her smile warm and proud. Then she turned to me and asked, almost absent-mindedly, "Did you finish your homework?" The tone was flat, like she didn't care about my effort, my creativity, or the hours I'd spent hoping to impress her. I felt my chest tighten, my stomach twisting as the warmth drained from my skin. It was the first time I felt truly invisible. Years went by and the pattern only got worse. Birthdays, holidays, family milestone ghost. I remember my 16th birthday clearly. I had planned a small surprise, a scrapbook filled with memories, notes from friends and a hand-written letter from my mom. I had stayed up all night, my hands sore and eyes blurry, folding the paper just right. When I handed it to her in the morning, her expression didn't change. She barely glanced at it, then set it aside and asked if Anna wanted pancakes. My heart broke in slow, silent pieces. I wanted to shout, to cry, to beg her to see me, but I only whispered a happy birthday to me. My voice shaking, she didn't respond. That day I realized the truth: love in my family was selective. I wasn't on the list. The second moment hit harder, years later. I was 21 and had just finished a stressful semester at college. I had sent her a letter, hoping she would finally acknowledge my efforts, my growth, my life outside the shadow of her favoritism. Instead, she called me once, barely lifting her voice, and said, "Why do you keep bothering me with your life? You're not important." My chest clenched so tightly I thought I might collapse. I sank into my dorm room chair, staring at the wall, every muscle taut with disbelief. I had always craved her recognition, and that night, I understood I would never receive it. Even everyday interactions became weapons. At family dinners, my opinions were dismissed, my achievements overshadowed by Anna's small victories. If I tried to share something meaningful, she would interrupt with a story about Anna, or worse, about herself, pretending my words didn't exist. The kitchen, once a place of warmth, became a stage where I performed invisibility, walking on eggshells to avoid making her irritation visible. I can still feel the coldness in the air when she ignored me at my graduation. She showed up, of course, but she didn't speak to me once. She posed for photos with Anna and my cousins, her smile bright, effortless. My robe felt heavy, my mortarboard like a crown I didn't deserve. I realized that day that her approval was never mine to earn, no matter how much I tried. Even my small victories outside her gaze were often tainted by her indifference. I remember the first time I got recognized at work, a genuine acknowledgement who appreciated my effort. I called her immediately, thinking she might finally be proud. "That's nice," she said almost dismissively. I could hear the slight smile in her tone, as if she were humoring me. And the fire inside me twisted into something sharper. By the time I turned 25, I understood the cruel pattern. I had spent my entire life chasing a shadow of approval from a woman who had no intention of giving it. Every holiday ignored, every word dismissed. Every moment I was pushed aside had accumulated, a quiet river of resentment flowing beneath the surface of my life. I stopped seeking her attention entirely. I stopped inviting her into my world. I learned to exist without her acknowledgement, even as the hurt lingered, raw and persistent. And yet, even as I built my life in quiet corners away from her, there was always a faint, persistent question in my mind. What had I done to deserve such erasure? The thought haunted me, twisting itself into my sleep and coloring my waking hours. Until the day came when I realized the truth: this neglect was never about me. It was about her need to control, to elevate one child while erasing another. And that realization, sharp and undeniable, sparked something I hadn't yet allowed myself to feel fully: a burning desire for the truth to finally come out. It was a Wednesday when it happened. The day that finally tore the quiet tolerance I had built around my heart. I had returned to Ashford for a small family gathering, one I usually avoided but had been convinced to attend by my sister. Anna, ever the golden child, was glowing with news of her promotion. My mom, as expected, was in her element, chatting warmly with everyone, a picture of pride and composure. I stepped into the kitchen, carrying a tray of my homemade muffins, hoping to contribute something small, something human, something that reminded me I still belonged somewhere. My mom didn't even look at me. She smiled at Anna and said, "Did you tell her about your new apartment? She'll love to hear." She didn't even bother saying hello. My chest tightened, my stomach coiling into knots as if I had been pushed into cold water. I tried to speak, to offer a simple, but my voice faltered under the weight of years of neglect. She brushed past me like I was air, her hand grazing my arm with a coldness that burned more than a slap ever could. The moment that broke me wasn't even overtly cruel, it was subtle. The kind of cruelty that lingers because it's quiet but undeniable. My mom had received a letter, an official document from my father's estate. I had been included, of course, legally, but she held it in her hands like a secret treasure meant only for Anna. My sister read aloud the contents, speaking of financial inheritances, old family investments, things I had every right to know, but my mom intervened mid-sentence. "You'll have to wait, Emily," she said smoothly, her tone soft but firm, like a doctor delivering bad news. "Some things are just not meant for you yet." I felt my stomach drop. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it against my ribs. Years of patience, of quiet endurance, of holding my hurt close to my chest, surged into a raw, boiling anger. I wanted to shout, to demand my rights. To call her out for every ignored birthday, every dismissed achievement, every moment she had treated me like I was invisible. But the words wouldn't come. I could only stand there, trembling, as she smiled at Anna, then looked away from me entirely. Later that evening, at the same gathering, my humiliation continued in smaller doses, sharper and more precise. She complimented Anna's cooking skills and made a point to say that her daughter had inherited the real talent in the family, a veiled dig at me, though phrased like a casual remark. I felt my hands clench, my nails digging into my palms, a burning ache spreading through my chest. The room spun slightly. The laughter around me a distorted soundtrack to my anger and disbelief. I wanted to vanish, to escape before I broke down entirely, but leaving felt like admitting defeat. The final blow came when she made a casual remark about my directionless life. Everyone laughed lightly, as if my existence were a punchline. I could feel the heat rising in my face, the shame pressing against my throat like it would choke me if I tried to speak. My mind raced, replaying every moment she had ever ignored me, every subtle insult, every birthday forgotten. I could feel the years of neglect stacking inside me. A tower of unspoken grievances that now threatened to topple. Walking home later that night, the streets empty and cold, I couldn't shake the humiliation. My hands were in my pockets, my breath misting in the winter air, but inside, I was a storm. I thought about every time I had tried to impress her, every small gift, every note, every effort to be seen. She had erased me at every turn, and now she was enjoying the satisfaction of doing it again, in front of everyone. I remembered the letters I had received from the estate, the old documents, the records of my achievements. A seed of clarity planted itself in my mind. This wasn't just neglect anymore. This was active erasure. She was still trying to control the narrative. To dictate what parts of me existed in the world and which parts didn't. My pulse raced, my stomach tight. By the time I reached my apartment, I couldn't sleep. I paced the small living room, the quiet broken only by the ticking clock and my own ragged breaths. I replayed the scene in my mind, every word, every glance, every laugh at my expense. And in the middle of that restless night, a thought solidified, sharp and undeniable. I wasn't gonna beg anymore. I wasn't gonna sit silently while she dictated my worth, while she continued to erase me. Something had to change, something had to be done. And this time, I wouldn't wait for her approval. I knew I would act, but I didn't know how yet. All I knew was that the next time we met, things would be different. Sleep eluded me for nights. My apartment, usually a sanctuary, felt like a cage, small walls pressing in as if they too knew I was on the edge of something. I would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, hands trembling. I replayed every moment with my mom, every subtle dismissal, every birthday forgotten, every glance of indifference that had carved itself into my memory. The memory of that family gathering, the way she smiled at Anna, the way she held the estate letter like a trophy, was burned into my mind like a live coal. I walked in circles, coffee cup in hand, staring out the tiny window at the street below. Ashford slept peacefully, unaware of the storm brewing above the bakery, unaware of the quiet fury that had grown inside me over years of neglect. My fingers traced the edge of the counter, my knuckles white, as I thought about everything I had tried to earn her recognition. Every card I had written, every small achievement I had shared, every effort to be seen. It had meant nothing to her. Nothing. I remembered the way her words had lighted on me as a child. "You're too soft," she would say, her tone casual but sharp, like a blade sliding across glass. Every syllable etched a scar that had never fully healed. And now, even as an adult, she continued to wield that same indifference as a weapon. I could feel my blood boiling, my chest tight, my stomach a knot of anger and disbelief. The quiet patience I had cultivated over the years was cracking. I thought about the first time I had truly felt invisible, at 12. Sitting at the dinner table with my meticulously built town model in front of me. Her eyes had barely glanced at it. And the 16th birthday, the scrapbook, the letter. Ignored, dismissed, set aside for Anna's accomplishments. Each memory was a hammer striking the nail of my resolve. I realized I had spent my life waiting for someone who would never see me, never appreciate me, never recognize that I existed beyond the shadow of my sister. I sat on the couch, head in my hands, my fingers tugging at my hair. I could feel the tension radiating down my shoulders, the ache in my neck, the restless energy thrumming through my veins. I thought about my life outside her reach, my work at the clinic, my friends who valued me, the small apartment that had become my refuge. But even these victories felt hollow without a confrontation of the truth, without finally acknowledging the depth of the betrayal. By the fourth sleepless night, I knew I couldn't go on like this. The quiet endurance that had carried me so far was no longer enough. I needed a plan, a way to reclaim not just my voice but my dignity. My thoughts turned to the documents I had ignored for so long, letters from the estate, records of family investments, old correspondences with lawyers. If she thought she could continue erasing me, she was wrong. I would gather proof, evidence, anything that showed the reality of my life and my rightful place in it. I stood, pacing the living room floor, my footsteps echoing in the small space. The decision settled in my chest like a living thing. I wasn't going to beg anymore. I wasn't going to plead for recognition or mercy. I would show her the truth, not in anger, not in shouting, but in a way she couldn't ignore. Her indifference had been a weapon for years, and now, the truth would become mine. I thought about the quiet revenge I could wield, exposing her favoritism, proving the deliberate erasure, showing the world who she had tried to hide me from. My hands tightened into fists, my heart raced, and for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of exhilaration. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about anger. It wasn't about recognition, dignity, and reclaiming the life she had tried to overwrite. I sat back down, my palms pressed to my face, breathing slowly, trying to calm the rush of adrenaline. The plan was not yet clear, the steps still forming in fragments in my mind. But one thing was certain: I would not let her control the narrative anymore. She had underestimated me for too long. And now, the quiet fire inside me was no longer content to burn silently. I spent the next week immersed in my own quiet war. My apartment, once a place of solace, became a command center. Documents, letters, old emails, and photographs were spread across the small table, each one a tiny weapon in my arsenal. I went through every piece of paper I could find, bank statements proving my rightful inheritance, letters from lawyers confirming my legal standing, notes from old family gatherings where she had intentionally excluded me. My hands shook as I held them, but this time the tremor was not fear. It was anticipation. I started small. I wrote emails to distant relatives I knew my mom had spoken poorly of me to, gently but firmly reminding them of facts, of my presence, of my achievements. Some responded warmly, others cautiously, unwilling to take sides. Each reply felt like a minor victory, proof that the world outside my mother's shadow was listening, was aware. I was no longer invisible. But nothing went perfectly. My first attempt to confront her with a letter summarizing my claims ended in failure. I had printed it carefully, choosing my words to be precise, unemotional, undeniable. I slipped it under her door, hoping to make her pause, to make her think. Instead, the next day, I found it crumpled in the trash can, barely legible. Her handwriting on a sticky note scrawled across it. "Stop bothering me." The coldness of her indifference was sharper than any insult. I felt my chest tighten, my stomach twist. I wanted to scream, to crumple the papers I had so carefully organized, but I forced myself to breathe. Setback number 1. I didn't stop. I reached out to old witnesses, cousins and neighbors who had seen the favoritism firsthand. I collected emails, photographs, and casual messages that showed the consistent pattern of erasure. Each document was a puzzle piece, a record of her neglect, her deliberate emotional manipulation. But gathering them was exhausting. Late nights turned into early mornings, my body ached, my fingers raw from flipping through files and typing endless notes. Some relatives refused to help, some openly sided with her, dismissing my efforts as unnecessary drama. The weight of doubt pressed on me: was this even worth it? Was anyone going to care about the truth? Then came the first major setback. I tried to confront her in a quiet moment at a family brunch, documents in hand, ready to speak calmly but firmly. I had rehearsed every word, every tone, every pause. I stepped into kitchen, my chest tight, my heart pounding, and began to speak. "Mom, I need to show you something important." She raised a finger, cutting me off with the softest, coldest words. "Emily, I don't have time for this. Not now. Not ever." My stomach sank. The papers felt heavy in my hands, the room tetting slightly, my cheeks hot with frustration and humiliation. I left without a word. my heart hammering, my mind racing. Even in defeat, I learned. I realized that brute force or direct confrontation wouldn't work. This had to be subtle, careful, undeniable. I had to expose the truth in a way that didn't depend on her reaction. It had to speak for itself, backed by evidence too clear to dismiss. My setbacks taught me patience, strategy, and precision. I started compiling everything into a timeline, a narrative of erasure that could not be ignored. I labeled photographs, organized emails chronologically, and typed summaries of conversations. I visualized the final moment. A quiet revelation, where she would have no choice but to acknowledge what she had done. And while the process was slow, exhausting, and often lonely, the fire inside me only grew brighter. One night, as I sat among the chaos of my apartment, a stack of papers in front of me, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. Every setback, every moment of dismissal, had taught me something. I realized that the fight wasn't about proving my worth to her, it was about proving it to myself, and to anyone who had ever been erased. My hands were raw, my back ached. But my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I knew the climax was coming. I could feel it in the rhythm of my heartbeat, in the sharp focus of my thoughts. I wasn't just preparing evidence, I was preparing a revelation, a moment of undeniable truth, that would leave no room for her carefully crafted indifference. And despite the failures, despite the setbacks that nearly broke me, I had one clear certainty. I wasn't going to stop until she had no choice, but to face the reality she had tried to erase. The day I decided to act, everything was meticulously planned. I wasn't going to yell, argue, or beg. This was not about confrontation, it was about undeniable truth. I gathered all my documents, letters, emails, photographs, and even old recordings of conversations where my mom had subtly erased me. Every piece was a brick in the wall of reality I was about to build, one she could not ignore. I arrived at the family home, calm but tense, clutching a folder that contained years of proof. My sister, as usual, greeted me with a warm smile, oblivious to the storm I carried in my chest. My mom glanced at me once, her eyes flickering briefly, but she quickly looked away, busying herself with a tray of tea. I stepped into the living room, heart pounding, and placed the folder on the table. The room went quiet almost immediately, a curious hush settling over everyone. I began, voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I've spent years being invisible to you, I said, addressing her directly. Ignored, dismissed, erased. I have proof of every time, every word, every moment you made it clear I didn't exist to you. And I want everyone here to see it. I opened the folder and laid the first set of documents before her. Photographs of birthdays where I had been left out. Letters I had written that were never acknowledged. Emails and notes proving my rightful inheritance. I spoke slowly, deliberately, narrating the timeline of erasure with calm precision. Every eye in the room followed my movements. Every person listening as if were seeing me for the first time. Her eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. She shifted in her chair, a subtle tightening of the jaw, the only sign of recognition that the truth had landed. My sister's smile faltered. The room, once warm and comforting, now felt heavy with tension. I continued, revealing each small injustice in sequence, my voice unwavering, my hands steady despite the pounding of my heart. When I presented the final letter, proof of her intentional favoritism, and the dismissal of my rightful inheritance, the silence was deafening. My mother didn't cry, didn't yell, didn't even speak. She just stared at the evidence, her fingers resting limply on the arm of the chair. Eyes fixed on the folder as though the weight of years had suddenly fallen upon her shoulders. My sister spoke first, her voice trembling. Emily, I had no idea. She looked at me, wide-eyed, and I could see the disbelief and guilt mixing in her expression. Others in the room murmured, some nodding, some whispering. Every word I had spoken, every piece of evidence I presented was a revelation. I watched my mother closely. She had no defense, no words, no excuses. The pride she had carried for decades, the control she thought she held over the narrative of our family, crumbled silently in the space between us. Her hands trembled ever so slightly. She avoided my gaze entirely, staring at the floor, the tea tray she had been holding now forgotten. I felt the tension in my chest ease slightly, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. This was not triumph in anger, this was recognition, undeniable and factual. No one needed to shout, no one needed to raise a voice. The collapse was quiet but complete. Her silence was louder than any apology could have been. And in that silence, I realized something profound. She had been forced to witness the truth she had tried to hide. And the weight of her own actions was visible in the rigid lines of her shoulders, in the cold avoidance of my gaze. For the first time, I saw her not as a mother who could hurt me, but as a woman confronted with the consequences of her own choices. And it was enough. I didn't need tears. I didn't need acknowledgement. I simply needed the truth to exist, unshakable and undeniable. I gathered my documents slowly, carefully, and left the room. I didn't speak. I didn't gloat. I simply walked out with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally reclaimed a part of themselves that had been denied for far too long. Behind me, the room remained still. My mother's silence spoke louder than any words ever could. Her shame unspoken but palpable, a mirror of the years she had spent erasing me. As I stepped into the crisp air outside, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't seeking revenge in the way most people imagine it. I had shown the truth, and that was enough. The power had shifted quietly, subtly, in the only way that mattered through undeniable reality. The days that followed were calm, almost eerily so. I returned to my apartment in Ashford, the small space that had once felt like a cage now a sanctuary. I placed the folder on my desk, neatly organized, knowing I didn't need it anymore. The evidence had been shown, the truth had been spoken. And the weight of years of neglect had finally been acknowledged, even if silently. I poured myself a cup of tea, the warmth grounding me, and let myself breathe. I thought about the family gathering, the way the room had fallen silent when I laid out the proof. My mother hadn't shouted, hadn't denied, hadn't tried to twist the narrative. She had only stared, silent, weighed down by the reality of her own choices. My sister had approached me cautiously, eyes wide, her hand brushing briefly against mine. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. Forgiveness wasn't my goal, it never had been. But acknowledgement, finally, was enough. Walking through Ashford the next morning felt different. The streets, the bakery below. Even the faint smell of rain on the pavement, all of it seemed sharper, clearer, as if my senses had been restored years of dull numbness. I felt lighter. Not because I had won anything in the traditional sense, but because the burden of the invisible, erased, and dismissed had been lifted. I kept in touch with a few family members who had witnessed the truth. They didn't offer to mediate or speak for me, they simply listened, validated, and quietly acknowledged my experience. For the first time in years, I felt that my life, my choices, and my achievements existed independently of my mother's indifference. I wasn't defined by her neglect. I wasn't waiting for approval that would never come. Even my mother's presence in my mind shifted. I no longer felt the cold knot of anxiety whenever I thought of her. The fear, the anger, the sting of being unseen, they were still there, faint echoes. But they no longer dictated my actions. I could remember the moments she had hurt me, without letting them control the present. It was a strange kind of freedom. Almost silent, almost unnoticed, but powerful in its way. I returned to my routine, the clinic, the small apartment, the quiet mornings alone. I allowed myself to enjoy simple pleasures without guilt or hesitation, the warmth of coffee in my hands, the hum of morning traffic, the sunlight streaming through my window. And each time, I felt a quiet pride in what I had accomplished, in the life I had built despite years of being overlooked and undervalued. One evening, I sat by my window, watching the town glow under the soft orange of sunset. I thought about the confrontation, the proof, the silent collapse of the woman who had tried to erase me. I didn't feel triumph, or vindictiveness, or joy in revenge. What I felt was something subtler, something deeper, a quiet satisfaction that comes not from defeating someone, but from reclaiming yourself. I had stood my ground, revealed the truth, and emerged intact, stronger, and whole. For the first time I realized that revenge doesn't have to be loud, it doesn't have to humiliate or shame. Sometimes, it's simply the act of existing fully, of being seen, of refusing to let some neglect define who you are. And in that moment, with the town stretching quietly below me, I finally understood the shift wasn't in her, it was in me. I had taken back my life, my dignity, my voice. The air in my apartment felt lighter, softer, as if it too had been waiting for this release. I sipped my tea, feeling it warm my hands, and let the quiet settle around me. The storm that had raged inside for so long had softened into a calm river, steady and unwavering. I wasn't seeking revenge anymore, because the truth had already done its work. And for the first time in my life, I could just be, Visa. Looking back now, I realized that the hardest battles aren't fought with words or actions, they're fought quietly, inside your own mind. For years, I carried the weight of being invisible, erased, and dismissed. I allowed her indifference to shape my self-worth, to dictate my confidence, to shadow every choice I made. And yet, that very weight became my teacher. It taught me patience, resilience, and the quiet power of truth. Revenge isn't always about confrontation or proving someone wrong. Sometimes, it's simply surviving, thriving, and refusing to let someone else's neglect define your life. I didn't need my mother to apologize, to acknowledge me, or to feel shame. The real victory was reclaiming myself, building a life where I was seen, where I mattered, where my achievements existed independently of her recognition. I learned that distance can be as powerful as confrontation. Walking away, refusing to beg, and choosing to act with precision and truth, allowed me to preserve my dignity. Her silent collapse wasn't satisfying, because I wanted her to suffer. It was satisfying because it reflected reality. The truth had a weight she could not deny, and for the first time, I wasn't invisible. Now, when I wake in my small apartment above the bakery, I feel the sunlight on my face and the warmth of coffee in my hands. I feel the pulse of a life lived fully, without apology or hesitation. I see the world clearly, not as a place where I am diminished, but as a space I can inhabit proudly, independently, and fully. What my mother never understood is that love, recognition, and dignity cannot be forced or taken. They must be earned, shared, and respected. And sometimes, the only way to reclaim them is to stand alone, quietly, firmly, and unapologetically. The storm of anger fades, replaced by calm. The years of hurt become lessons, the neglect becomes fuel, and the silence becomes a space where you can finally hear yourself. I don't need her to see me now. I don't need her approval. I am enough. And I always was. The truth freed me, and in that freedom, I discovered the quiet, unshakable strength that comes from surviving, existing, and thriving on your own terms. That is the revenge that lasts, the kind that cannot be undone, and the kind that matters most, the reclamation of self. Recognized and free.